Thank you guys for being here. As Matt mentioned, I'm Jeremy Newman, VP of Policy and Engagement for the Family Freedom Project. I'm actually going to be talking to you guys under two different hats tonight because I also hold the same position for the Texas Homeschool Coalition. So let me start by just getting a feel for the room here. How many of you guys are familiar already with some of the work of the Texas Homeschool Coalition or the Family Freedom Project? Okay, so let me kind of start by giving you just a brief history on the parental rights issue, because over the last year and a half or so, a bunch of people have suddenly become kind of captured by the issue, but the history of the people who worked on parental rights in Texas has been the homeschool community for the last 3 decades. And that's kind of the reason there's this relationship between the Family Freedom Project and the Texas Homeschool Coalition. And back in the 80s and 90s, Tim Lambert, who you see as the president of the Family Freedom Project, he launched the Texas Homeschool Coalition. And at that time, it was in response to an effort by the state to make homeschooling illegal in Texas. And they were prosecuting and literally putting in jail families who were homeschooling. And that was the 80s and 90s, not that long ago, right? And then they fought this battle all the way up to the Texas Supreme Court until they got a decision from the Texas Supreme Court saying homeschooling in Texas is a type of private school. It's just as legal as any other type of private school. And we've been fighting the battle for the last 30 years to, not just get that kind of landmark ruling, but reform all of the laws related to homeschooling in order to be able to ensure that Texas is one of the most homeschool-friendly states in the country. But along the way, all of those people who fought that battle realized that homeschooling is not just about education, right? It's about the right of families to raise their child, because there are very, very few people, maybe more now than there used to be, but very few people who go to the effort of homeschooling just because they like the academics. The academics are enticing when you look at the statistics, but the reality is that most people have values they want to teach their children. And in order for you to be able to teach your children values, you have to have the right to raise your children. And Tim likes to tell this story that back in the 90s, the Attorney General of Texas was Jim Maddox. And there was this quote from Jim Maddox that he gave at an event where he said that he didn't think parents were qualified to even raise their children, much less teach them at home. And so we've gravitated away from that culture as a state over the last 30 years, but we're in new territory now from the parental rights perspective. And back in 2010, THSC kind of formalized, Texas Homeschool Coalition formalized this involvement in the parental rights issue because it had been part of the work for the 20 years up until that point, where it was always the homeschoolers who were up at the Capitol working on medical, the right of families to make medical decisions, religious decisions, educational decisions. It was always the homeschool community. And then 2010, we formalized that into THSC's mission statement. And one of the catalysts for that was that we had this case come up where, and this was actually a father from Fort Worth, where he was a homeschool dad, and his wife had died, and his in-laws decided they didn't like the fact that he was homeschooling. So they sued him for custody of his daughter. And the only allegation against him was that they didn't like the fact that he was homeschooling. And that case went on for 2 or 3 years before we were even aware of it. And then we got involved and we hired actually an attorney some of you guys might know, Jim Pickle, who's in Collin County. And he helped litigate that case. And if you guys don't know how the jury process works, in a civil case, one of the first things they do in a jury is that they'll go have a vote to figure out where everybody stands right after all the arguments. When they had that first vote, it was 11-1 against the father. The one vote in the father's favor was a homeschool dad who happened to be on the jury. And they deliberated for somewhere approximated a week, and they came back and the vote had flipped 11-1 in favor of the father. And so, it was always our opinion that God placed that one homeschool father on the jury in order to sway all of these other people on this issue for them to understand, put yourself, and this is kind of the argument he made, is put yourself in the position of the father, right? You're doing what you think is best for your child. Is that enough for somebody else to be able to come in and just say, I disagree, therefore I'm taking your child? And so that was kind of a catalyst for us to realize, we have to get more involved at the policy-making level on all issues related to parental rights.
I'm sorry, guys. Footy's here. Jesus Christ, I'm so sorry.
You're good. We got it.
So, and by the way, this can be somewhat informal, so you guys can stop me if you have burning questions at any point, but I'll just assume not if you don't. And we'll probably have time for some at the end. But the point is that That was a launching pad. And so we became much more actively involved instead of just kind of reactively involved in the legislature at that point on the issue of parental rights. We started drafting and bringing our own legislation to fix some of the problems that we saw. And then I joined the team in 2013, THSC's legislative team. And so it was fairly soon after we had formalized that issue as part of our mission statement. And since that time, it has developed to the point where we realized last year, like, this is the bulk of the policy work that we do, is parental rights, not just education freedom. And the reason that we launched out this affiliate organization, this new organization, the Family Freedom Project, was because we realized that we needed to be able to grow both of these two things independently. So that's kind of a brief history on the issue for you guys, for you to understand the relationship between homeschooling and parental rights in Texas. And incidentally, if you look around the country, you will find that in most states, that's roughly the story, is that homeschool families were the ones who were predominantly the drivers of parental rights legislation. And so right now, we're working on, I'm going to kind of cover four main issues that we're working on under either the Homeschool Coalition or Family Freedom Project. There's a lot more parental rights stuff going on, so you guys can bring any of that up if you might have questions on. But the very first one, how many of you guys have heard that there's a parental rights constitutional amendment proposed by the legislature? Okay, not many. So I'll get to in a minute to the reasons why that might be the case. But the big picture is that we realized 10 years ago that this was going to be important, but we didn't think politically it was going to be possible to get an amendment passed in Texas. And the reason is because when you pass a constitutional amendment, you need 2/3 votes in each chamber. It's not enough to have a simple majority. And we haven't had 2/3 majority Republicans in the House and the Senate since the late 2010s, I think. And so politically, it was just not feasible to get an amendment passed. The thing that changed in the last 2 years is that suddenly everybody became interested in the parental rights issue. And so we realized that now's kind of the moment politically when it might be possible to get something like that passed. And by that time, we had spent enough time litigating some of those constitutional issues on parental rights that we knew what the status of the constitutional law was. So we worked with our appellate attorney, we drafted a constitutional amendment for parental rights that is, in practical terms, it's almost a restatement of some protections that we already have in federal law. But the reason that it's needed in Texas is because, two things. First of all, right now, most people don't realize that the majority of the rights and protections that parents have rest in the hands of federal judges. And those people are in there for life by appointment. But every time an appointment turns over, all of that can change. And it's kind of a precarious place for such an important right to rest. And so just from a longevity perspective, we realized that that's not a good place to put something so important. And we want to put it in the Texas Constitution because that ensures its longevity. It is really hard to take something out of the Texas Constitution. And if the federal case law ever does turn against parents, you have that protection still in Texas. And the second thing is that it's spread out through 100 years of case law right now. So if you find yourself in court on an issue of parental rights that's of constitutional magnitude, the only way you vindicate that is if you have an attorney who's well-versed enough on the issue that he knows to go read 100 years of case law to make the arguments to the judge that will win your case. There are very, very few attorneys in Texas who have that type of knowledge of the law, and even fewer judges who care about it. So the reality is that there are so many laws and rules on the books that most judges and most attorneys don't look super far past the statute. And so one of the goals is to condense all of these things, all of these rights that parents have, but that are hard to vindicate right now, and put them directly into the Texas Constitution as a matter of clarity for the judges and the attorneys, so that you're able to vindicate those rights even if you don't have $15,000 to get to the Court of Appeals. So we have right now, that bill is filed, it's HJR 85 is the bill number, and that's filed in the Texas House by two legislators, HJR 85, I think I said 45, sorry, HJR 85. And it's actually filed by two legislators right now in the Texas House. One of them is State Representative James Frank, and he's the chair of the Human Services Committee. He's also a homeschool dad, incidentally. And the second one is Chairman Dustin Burrows, who's the chair of the Calendars Committee. So they were both our top picks in the Texas House for people that we wanted to carry this issue because, first of all, both of them are known on the issue of parental rights in the House. And the second one is they have a tremendous amount of credibility. especially on those types of issues in the Texas House. And we knew that simple political pressure was not going to be the way to get the amendment passed, because you have to have 2/3 majority votes. And so, it can't just be a partisan battle, because if it's partisan, by definition, you lose. And so we went out looking for lawmakers who had a tremendous amount of credibility on the issue and who were in a position of leadership such that they could actually make a lift that heavy. And both of them expressed a lot of interest in it. Both of them filed it. And in the Texas Senate, Senator Brian Hughes has indicated that he's planning to file it. And so we're waiting on that. And I'm always optimistic 2 months into session because nothing has died yet. But I'll tell you that I think the prospects for it are actually good, despite the fact that it requires a 2/3 vote. And here's one of the reasons is that, typically on an issue that's really important, it does break along partisan lines, and that makes it difficult. But one of the things that we tried to do in the drafting of this amendment was avoid verbiage that would turn it into a partisan issue. And because really what we're talking about is putting into the Texas Constitution what is technically already the law at the federal level. And so even for lawmakers who might not love the issue of parental rights, it's hard to vote against that, right? Because right now nobody wants to be the person who voted against parental rights. And if you're voting for something that is actually kind of the law already, it's even harder to vote against it. And here's the other thing is that there are a lot of parental rights issues kind of at the level of detail that are important to solve. But at the constitutional level, those are not typically the issues you're solving. You're trying to put in something at the high level constitutionally. And so it's hard for people to come in and say, this amendment is a partisan issue because it's dealing with the partisan divide in education or medical issues or something like that, because it's not quite at that level of detail where you're going into the schools and telling them, here are the 5 different forms you have to give the parent, here's the decision-making tree you have to follow. That's the type of thing you work out in a typical bill, but not in a typical amendment. And so one of the benefits that we're hoping that we have from that dichotomy is that we can pass something that is high level enough and yet substantive enough that is easy to vote for and it is hard to vote against. So we'll see if we can thread that needle, but I'm optimistic at this point that we can. And that's kind of the first issue is the constitutional amendment. That's the biggest issue that we're working on. And I'll spend less time on the second one because it's, yeah.
Jeremy, I'm sorry, didn't hear you mention, what does the text of the amendment say?
Yes.
If you could just paraphrase it.
I'll paraphrase it, yes. There are 2 main sections. The first one says that parents have a fundamental right to raise their children, and that includes the ability for them to make decisions over, I'm going to paraphrase this list, education issues, medical issues, religious freedom issues, the care, the control, and the upbringing of their child, and there are probably 2 or 3 things that are placed there. But the idea is that parents have the right to make all decision making for their child. That's the first section. The second section is a little bit more legalese. Does anybody know what the strict scrutiny test is? A couple people. I see you nodding your head. That's because you're an attorney. So the in simple terms, strict scrutiny tells the state under what conditions they can interfere in whatever the right is that's in question. And so there are different levels of judicial scrutiny that a court will use depending on how significant or how important the issue is. Strict scrutiny is the highest level that exists. And so basically what it's saying is that the state is not allowed to interfere in the right that a parent has to raise their child unless they are required to interfere in order to protect some compelling state interest, such as the life of the child, right? You can't kill your child. And then, so that's the first thing, it has to be a compelling state interest. And the second thing is, whatever intervention the state is using has to be the least restrictive intervention that you could imagine in order to solve that problem. So you can't say, hey, I found 5 bad parents, I'm going to take the kids away from all parents. That's not narrowly tailored, right? So you have to craft, whatever solution the state is going to craft has to be as narrow as it can possibly be to get in, solve the one problem, and get out. That's the idea. So those are the 2 sections. The first one outlines what the rights are. The second one outlines that the only condition under which the state can interfere in that right is if they pass this highest level of judicial scrutiny. So you can, it's a fairly easy read. It's like, I think it all fits on one page. And so if you go look up HJR 85, you'll be able to see that. So that's the first bill. The second one I'm going to talk about two issues that are actually inside the same bill, but I'll split them out for clarity. This is also kind of a derivative of the constitutional issue for parental rights. And back in 2000, the U.S. Supreme Court came out with this decision called Troxel versus Granville. And in that decision, what the U.S. Supreme Court said is that if there's a dispute, a parenting dispute between a parent and a non-parent, the judge doesn't just get to break the tie. They don't get to just substitute their opinion for the opinion of the parent. You have to start with the assumption. As a constitutional matter, you are required to start with the assumption that whatever decision the parent made is in the best interest of the child already. So the point there is that you don't end up in a situation between a parent and a judge where it's just a difference in parenting philosophy and the judge wins because they're the judge. The point is that it is constitutionally required that if they're going to interfere with the decision a parent has made for their child, they must first overcome this presumption in the parent's favor. So we've actually been litigating this in Texas for the last 10 years. And in 2020, we got the most significant decision on this from the Texas Supreme Court, as far as I know, in its history. And it was a unanimous opinion that basically restated what I just said in Texas terms. Because we're kind of, up until that point, we had been using federal law to argue Texas cases. And in 2020, we won that case at the Texas Supreme Court with a number of other organizations so that we had a clear statement from the Texas Supreme Court to the effect that you have to start with the presumption in favor of the parent. And it's interesting that, I don't know how clearly people have conceptualized the battleground of parental rights in the legal sphere, like in the courts. But almost every case, every major case on parental rights that has happened in the courts is a dispute between a biological parent and either an extended family member or like a significant other, a boyfriend or something like that, and somebody who has some tangential relationship, maybe even a somewhat significant relationship with the child, but the dispute arises because they believe they could parent the child better. And then you end up in court, and the history on it up until the last few years has typically been, the rule is whoever has more money wins. And one of the things we've been trying to change about putting some of these rules directly into Texas law is that we want people to be able to win even if they can't afford to get to the Court of Appeals. Because we want it to be stated so clearly that even a judge who's predisposed against the parent can't ignore how clear this rule is. And so that was in 2020 that we won that case with a few different organizations who were involved in that as well. And then what we have in the bill, which is House Bill 730 is the bill I'm talking about now, and it has a bunch of stuff in it, so I'm going to focus on a couple different things. This first one is the very first section of the bill where it just says that in any dispute between a parent and a non-parent, the court must start with the presumption that whatever decision the parent is making is already in the best interest of the child. And we have another case actually at the Texas Supreme Court we're working on right now that's dealing with a follow-up question to that exact same issue. Because what I just stated is just a presumption in the parent's favor, but there's this lingering question of, okay, now suppose that we do have a parent, but we think they're making a decision that is actually harmful to the child. Under what circumstances can we intervene? And I would say the legal answer is somewhat clear. I would state the definition of the law this way. The legal answer is really clear. We just need the Texas Supreme Court to say it. So it's kind of been said by every other person in every other way except by the Texas Supreme Court on this specific issue. And the rule essentially is that the only time you can overcome that presumption and interfere with the rights of a parent is to protect the child from significant harm. And the word significant is important, significant, because it means that it can't just be a parenting dispute, right? This has to be a level of harm that is going to cause significant, long-lasting damage to this child. That is the only time under which you're allowed to interfere. And the reason for that is that if you flip the presumption or you degrade it in any way, the situation you end up with is that now the child has 5 parents or 10 parents or 15 parents, right? The easier it is for non-parents to get in, the more parents the child ends up with, kind of in practical terms. I don't mean in legal terms. Just in practical terms, the more people who are making decisions for this child, the harder that is on a child. The way that our appellate attorney explains it is that you can kind of conceptualize the child's life as a bucket, and every time you bring somebody else in to make decisions for that child, you have to take a little bit more of the child's life out of that bucket and give it to this other person. There's only so much to go around. And that's one of the reasons that it's important to keep parents in the driver's seat because it's not just a neutral act to take away some of that decision-making power and give it to somebody else. It splits the child in kind of difficult, important ways. And then here's the other thing is that just as a matter of biology, the parent is the one most likely to care the most for the longest about this child. And so just strategically, if you were just setting this up as a policy matter and not even as a moral matter, you would say, here's the person most likely to make the right decision most of the time. We're going to put them in the driver's seat. Yes?
How does that change the gender modification now being a hot spot?
Okay, I'm glad you asked that question. I was wondering if we would get here. So, I'll answer this a couple different ways. So, we had this question actually about the constitutional amendment because it says parents have the right to make medical decisions. But remember the second prong of that bill. The second prong is the state is allowed to interfere if it's necessary to achieve a compelling state interest by the least restrictive means possible. So here's something that's important. Whether we pass that constitutional amendment or not, that is the law. And so any law that Texas passes to try and restrict the ability of parents to make any type of medical decision, including gender modification, it will only survive in the courts if it can pass that test. And so the position the state is in is that we have to be able to win the argument of saying the state must interfere to prevent parents from making that particular medical decision for their child because it's a compelling state interest, right? This is the life of the child that we're talking about, and we're going to do it by the least restrictive means possible. This one is important. This actually makes a big difference in what types of laws we can and should pass in Texas to prevent that. It means that you have to be really careful about how you craft the law to prevent gender modification because if it can be construed in a way that interferes, that interferes with parents' rights more broadly than that in the medical sphere, it's going to fail. It'll get overturned by the courts. Yeah?
So, on top of that, though, we are pushing bills really hard to end it, to coincide with that bill. So, that bill allows parents to have more rights, but then we are setting up what we're calling a trigger bill. I can't remember the exact number. I just had the call last week. But it's almost going to be like a trigger bill where as soon as something like that goes into effect, where we have stronger parental rights, we're pushing out a bill that completely is banning any gender modification by doctor's advice, by whatever, because there are a lot of doctors pushing it on parents right now. And we have that going, so I just want to let everyone know that that's not good. We're trying not to have that be a pressing issue. We're trying to set up trigger bills.
Yeah, I was about to say, it's like a way to circumvent that is just making certain doctors lose their license if they perform.
That's what we're doing. We're pressing criminal action in the bill too.
Yeah.
But
on the second prong of the constitutional amendment you're talking about, while we're on this topic, so what concerns me is that the other side is going to, they have been trying to build the case that not, destroying somebody's biology is significant harm. So, does this constitutional amendment make it more likely that somebody on the other side is going to try to litigate for such a change, try to take somebody's kids away because they won't chop their privates off?
Right, so this is where it gets important, the point I made earlier, that this is the constitutional amendment, this is one of the reasons we drafted this way. It's a restatement of the laws that are already required under the U.S. Constitution. What that means is that the argument that you just made there, that argument will take place whether the amendment passes or not, and any attempt that Texas makes to prevent the procedure will fail or succeed based on that same argument, whether the amendment passes or not. So the point is, we have to win that argument. And I think as a matter of data, actually, it's fairly straightforward to win the argument. People disagree with me sometimes, right? But here's one of the benefits that it does have, is that at some level, it takes the question out of the jurisdiction of federal courts. Because right now, you have the same argument that we just described, and the federal courts get final say. But if you put it in the Texas Constitution, you have the same argument, but Texas courts get final say. And that's better for us, right? Because, as bad as some Texas courts are, most Texas courts are way better than most federal courts. And so just from a political perspective, that's actually one reason why it might be easier to win the argument. But the point remains, you have to win the argument either way. And here's another point that I've made, and I've had disagreement with some of my conservative friends on this particular point. I think that what you just described is the proper way to address this, which is that you put the restrictions on doctors, you put it on medical providers, on hospitals, on the therapist, that type of thing.
So you close that loophole of the question of if they can do it or not.
Right.
When you make that argument, you've already got the laws set in place that where the doctors can't do it, and if they do, they lose their license, they get arrested. So
Right, so
it's a matter of
From-
combining those.
Yeah, from an enforcement standpoint, it's like, it's a lot easier to monitor, a handful of doctors than it is to monitor every parent in the state to make sure they're following the law.
Right, and one of the other reasons is that as a legal matter, it is easier to say, hey, this procedure is outlawed, meaning doctors can't even perform it, and so parents, sorry, you're not able to get this for your child because it doesn't exist. That's one argument. It would be a totally different argument to say, yes, the procedure is legal, we've allowed doctors to continue doing it, but parent, we're going to prosecute you if you do it. That is a much harder legal argument to win.
What if in conjunction with your, constitutional amendment, what if in your law, what if you just say that it is the presumption of the state that this is not an infection? That would at least resolve that one problem. Because the other side is, they're trying to make the argument that you're doing significant harm by not doing this. They're trying to make this argument for years. They're saying that everybody's killing themselves. So you got to foreclose it.
If the procedure is illegal in the first place, then that closes that hole right there.
Yeah, so
We've made it state law
there
to
are-
eliminate the procedure entirely. If they want it, they can go out of state. Like if the parents are fighting
Yeah.
that hard, and that's going to be the reality with the bills
I
we're
know,
setting up.
yeah.
There are bills that have been submitted to make gender modification surgeries illegal for anyone under the age of 18.
And we're pushing
So
it hard.
in practical terms, if you pass a bill that makes the procedure illegal, it is what you're talking about.
Okay.
With different words, it's saying the same thing, is the policy of the state is that this procedure is bad, so we're gonna ban it. And I think that could succeed if, because it's obvious that you have a strong argument, it's a compelling state interest to protect the kid, right? And if you pass it in that form, I think you also have a pretty strong argument that you did it, you solved the problem by the least restrictive means possible, right? And here's one of the other things that I don't want this point lost in the conversation, that it's not just about the most efficient way to ban the procedure or the legally strongest way. That is important. I also think that the position that let me ask this, who's read the book Irreversible Damage? Anybody? It's on this topic. Two books I highly recommend on this. One of them is Irreversible Damage. You've read half of it? Okay. The second one is called The End of Gender. It's almost the opposite of what the title makes it sound like. But both of them are on this subject, and one of the things that becomes really crystal clear if you read those two books is that the standard story of a family who's in this situation is some type of confusion arises with the child. Parent goes to some medical professional that they trust. The medical professional tells them, if you don't do this, your child will kill themselves. And so here's the situation that parents are in at that point, is that if they trust their medical professional, and we can debate how wise that is in all circumstances, but the point is, they've certainly been taught to trust them, and broadly that's probably wise. If they trust their medical professionals, and they think that the situation they're in is do this to my child or kill my child, what do you expect most parents to do? Most parents are going to get the procedure. And so it's legally complicated to step in at that point and say that we're going to punish the parent for doing the thing that they thought they had to do in order to save the life of their child. So it is a complicated issue from certain angles. The angle that I think is the least complicated and probably the most effective policy solution is to go in and say that it's illegal for doctors to do it, or insurance won't cover it, or some combination of all of these things. But frankly, the one I think is the most important is to open up civil liability to make it easy for someone to sue for malpractice for a longer period of time. Because here's the thing, if we don't change anything about this, the entire thing will come crumbling down within the next 10 years or so when all of the civil lawsuits do come around. And so I think the fastest way to speed that up is to make it easier to file those. And there's actually one of these happening in California right now with a child who I think...
You talking about Jeff?
No. Is Jeff Younger who you're talking about?
Yeah, he's not.
You're talking about the
His wife moved to
16-year-old
California, but this is
Yeah.
different. So the case I'm talking about, I'm going to get some of the ages a little bit wrong, but I think the story was that it was a biological girl who had a double mastectomy, I think at the age of 13, and she's now 15 or 16, I believe, and she's filed a malpractice lawsuit against her physician and her therapist and I don't know, half a dozen other people on the theory that not only was there no scientific basis for this in the first place, but there was no informed consent. Even if she gave consent in a technical sense, it was definitely not informed. Right? Because there was no process involved with making sure that she actually had the information to understand the consequences of the decisions she was making. And in all likelihood, she's now maybe sterile for life, and at the very least, incapable of breastfeeding. And it's like things like that, how do you expect a 13-year-old to understand the significance of those decisions? So my point just being that as a medical practice, this all falls apart as soon as those cases become normal. And that's going to happen over the course of 10 years on its own, even if we don't step in and do anything about it. But the best way, I think, to solve the problem fast enough is to make that easier. And anyway, that was kind of a long tangent on that question, but I assume we'd get there. So that whole first section of House Bill 730 was the bill that we used as a venue into that conversation. But that first section of it says that you have to start with the presumption that a decision made by a parent is in the best interest of the child. And then the rest of the bill is actually dealing with probably half a dozen different types of CPS reform. And it'll take too long to get into all of those, but let me highlight one for you that's kind of significant.
I was about to say, I like this, like the way you're handling this, because if you say, oh, parental freedom, I mean, a lot of people are going to vote for that, but if you kind of restructure that where, you know, you make it sound too oppressive and too restrictive on the parents, that's not political opposition bills.
Yeah.
Whereas if you just target the doctors or something like that, you know, it's like, oh, it's not affecting me, it won't even show up on most people's radar screen. Whereas if it's like, the government's going to say you can't do that, then that's when you start having all these woke parents start showing up at Capitol Hill.
Yeah.
Oh no, they're gonna get their side together. They're gonna call us monsters no matter what.
Yeah, but you still wanted to, you know, you'd rather be a much smaller army than them like making it blatantly obvious that.
And I'll tell you that politically, inside the legislature, like I don't know what's going to actually pass, but the chances of something passes that targets the doctors, the medical system, is 10 times higher than the chances of something passes that targets the families. So even just politically is much more feasible to solve it that way than in any other way. So I won't go into all the different types of CPS reform. I feel like it seemed like you were trying to raise your hand or deciding if you were going to raise your hand. Okay. So let me give you one example. This is not technically accurate, but it is effectively accurate. That in Texas we have 2 foster care systems. One that's run by the state and one that is run with essentially no oversight by anybody. And I'll explain now why that makes sense. That we have the actual foster care system everybody knows about, right? Where you have to go through certain legal procedures in order to get a child removed from their home and then placed in foster care with somebody who signs up to be a foster parent. Well, the second, what I'm going to call the second foster care system, and what some people call the hidden foster care system, is where pretty much everything I just described happens, except there's no court involved, there's no attorney involved, and it's all done under the auspices of being voluntary. So what happens is CPS shows up at the family's door, and often it's because they lack the evidence to just do a removal right then. And so they'll tell the family, hey, if you will voluntarily place the child outside of the home with somebody else for some indefinite period of time, then we won't go take your child in court. And so what does the family do? Well, they place the child outside of the home with somebody else for an indefinite period of time. And right now, I mean, I don't know what the numbers are right now because it's not really tracked, but the last estimate was that the number of kids in foster care, the way I just described, is approximately equivalent to the number of kids who are actually in foster care. And what that would mean is the foster care system is roughly double what we say it is. And again, it's hard to get actual data on that because it's essentially all off the books, and the reason is because they say, well, it's voluntary. But it's only voluntary in the sense that you are holding a gun to someone's head and saying, if you don't do this, we will take your child.
But how many of those kids that are gone through involuntary will ever return to their...
Well, that would be easier to answer if it were tracked.
Right,
So,
I mean, that's not going to be tracked, so you don't know if they're really fulfilling their offer to them that if you involuntarily release your child,
Right, so what I can tell you is the standard experience of the families that we work with who are in that system, it's called a parent-child safety placement usually, and it's done as a voluntary contract with the family. And the standard experience is that once the child is out of the home, now it's easy for CPS, right? They don't have anything else they need to do. Like now this is a safe status quo, they can leave that way forever. And administratively, it's easier for them to do it that way. There's zero urgency for CPS to resolve the issue once the child is out of the home. And so those continue for months, sometimes they continue for years, and there is never an attorney and there is never a judge involved in the entire thing. And so, well, in theory, you can go pick up your child at any time if you're willing for the state to show up at your door and take your child from you. So that's the situation the families are in. So basically, and here, like I just described that in super negative terms, right? There is a situation where it's actually positive, which is where CPS says, look, like there's a danger to this child, and it's resolvable if you can just place the child outside of the home for a week, a month, something like that. We'll avoid the litigation and we'll avoid, the possibility of terminating parental rights. And if they actually do that and resolve it quickly and put the child back, that's preferable to taking the family through a year of litigation and terminating their parental rights, right? If you can solve the problem that way, that's better. The issue is, once you put the child outside of the home, all urgency goes away for the state to do anything about putting the child back, and there's no accountability. So what we do in the bill is we first put deadlines on the agreement to say it can only last so long, and that if it's going to go beyond that, it kicks it into a part of the system that involves a court-appointed attorney for the family, so that it will only continue beyond a certain point if the family has an appointed attorney who tells them this is actually in your best interest for it to continue. So that's one of about half a dozen things that CPS-related reforms that are also included in that bill, and that's House Bill 730. And so the last main issue I wanted to touch on is school choice, parental choice. So who's already following this issue closely? Okay, good. So we're just one of many organizations who are involved in that. And I would say in some ways we take a broader approach than most other organizations because we also have this paired interest of parental rights broadly, right? So obviously we're out there defending the right of homeschool families to homeschool their child and make educational decisions. But we're also out there defending any bill that increases the options that families have to make educational decisions. And one of those, part of that's on principle, part of it is just as a practical matter, the theory of homeschooling is that you should be able to construct the form of education that you think is best for your child. And especially with the advent of technology over the last 20 years, most families now patch together a form of education from half a dozen different providers and 5 different styles, and sometimes it's different for every child, and sometimes even for one child, it evolves 5 times over the course of the child's education. The point is that diversity is the name of the game in terms of education styles right now. And that the theory is that the more options you can present to the parent, the easier it is for parents from a huge diverse set of backgrounds with students who have a huge diverse set of needs to be able to construct something that is best for their particular child. That's all kind of at the theoretical level. All of that was accelerated by COVID, right? And I won't rehash COVID for everybody because I'm sure you've been over that. But the point is that the appetite for that grew tenfold probably during COVID. That's hyperbole, but I'm going to say tenfold during COVID. And a lot of people who were previously of the mind that a semi-rigid system was the best way to go experienced during COVID what happens when you go through crisis. Now that was a system-wide crisis, but individual families go through crisis all the time, right? And so what people experienced was it showed them what happens in the system when even one family goes through crisis. It's the same thing they experienced when everyone went through crisis during COVID, because if someone loses their job, they lose the means of transportation, right? They lose income, somebody gets sick. All of these things become nearly impossible burdens on some families if their entire schedule is built around a rigid education system. It is really, really, really hard to get your kids to and from school and ensure they have a good education especially if it's 8-10 hours of your day, and also deal with 1 or 2 or 3 or 5 life crises. One of the reasons that people moved so much to homeschooling is because they discovered not only is it stable, but it's also flexible at the same time. And those are the two things that people needed. And now people are trying to figure out, how do we construct that, how do we give those same two things to people, not just in homeschooling, but broadly. So the biggest version of the idea, I guess, that's being presented in the legislature is some form of the money follows the child, right? Where there are half a dozen different ideas about how to construct it, but the rough idea is the state sends X number of dollars to the school already for your child, but your child's not in school, or maybe your child is in school but they're leaving, and so now those dollars will follow the child, or some portion of the dollars follow them, and you can use them to pay for the child's actual education. So right now, homeschoolers in Texas, we have somewhere between 600,000 and 750,000 homeschoolers in Texas. There are more homeschoolers in Texas than charter school students and private school students combined. And that saves the state a lot of money, billions with a B.
But that's not the response that you get from superintendents. I mean, they want
It's definitely not the response you get from superintendents.
they want, as a kid on a bus, they get so much money for the kid on the bus.
Yeah.
As a kid in school. And
Well, no,
so,
nobody likes the idea of possibly getting fired if you're doing a crap job, so.
There you go.
Yeah,
That's
so
what happens if you suck too much, people leave your school and you get fired, so.
So I think that, I do make political predictions, but in the last 2 presidential elections, both of my predictions were wrong. So take all of my predictions with a grain of salt. But I think there's a decent probability of some version of education choice getting passed this session. And the reason is because across all political demographics and all income demographics and all ethnic demographics, the majority of people support some version of the dollars follows the child policy. And most states, more than 30 of them, have some version of that policy now. So by every metric, Texas's current policy is behind the curve. Yes?
So have you looked into House Bill 38 and 29 regarding taxation with the school districts? I saw that they were being passed on my last policy meeting, and I don't think that's something that we're focusing enough on. It's trying to eliminate the school taxes
Right.
on people. I mean, it's ridiculous, especially in Rockwall County, the amount that you're taxed when you're a grandparent
Right.
or you're homeschooling and you've homeschooled for 2 generations and you're still getting taxed. Is that a priority at all, those 2
Yeah,
bills?
so I don't know the policy of the bill by number, but in terms of the concept of the bill, a lot of states have done some version of this where they do a tax credit, which means that you don't pay the money on the front end, instead of something like an education savings account, which is where you get the money back on the back end. And it would be easier to do that in Texas if our taxing system were different. Like a lot of states have an income tax. It's a lot more straightforward.
That's what the bill's proposing. It's proposing to eliminate school taxes in favor of not an income tax, but putting it somewhere else.
Yes.
The terms aren't clear yet because it hasn't been passed, it hasn't been named there, but it's not gonna go into income tax.
And income tax is impossible, practically speaking, in Texas.
Yeah.
They won't do that, but they're looking for other places to allocate it. They're doing all of the research now so that when it comes time to be on the floor.
How about we just say, fucking fund the students and quit worrying about the school districts? Like, who cares? I'm being completely honest right here. I pay a mountain of taxes in the state. I moved my family to one of the best school districts in the state, and we hate it. I'm trying everything I can to get my kids out of the school system because they live in Google Chromebooks. Like, they're not learning shit.
The reason why they're so opposed to it is because you have a bunch of Republicans representing like podunk areas, and like the school will be like the largest employer, and so it's like the reverse mentality though. It's like technically if you're the government, you're supposed to be serving the people, but it's like the reverse mentality because they're like, no, all of you plebes are supposed to serve the teachers. All these decisions revolve around the government workers that can't get fired. But no, we're not gonna target your kids and make them better. We gotta provide infinite job security because these teachers are coming down from heaven to indoctrinate your kids. So
Somebody's got to spend $90 million on 9th grade campus, right? Might as well be RCAD.
what you have to do, your counties, many counties like in Van Zandt, that's the largest employment that we have in so many counties is, you're gonna be contending with all that.
Yeah.
And why are we okay with that? Just like generally speaking, like the government being the biggest employer in all the counties. In America, the government's the biggest employer. Like it feels like the rest of us are just working to pay them.
Because of the unions, exactly.
Yeah, well, and here's the thing, we think that we're a red state. All that happened is you have a bunch of Democrats, one is Republicans, is red districts. So like, I'll just change the yard next to my neighbor and run that way. Now I'm gonna vote against school choice.
We're talking about maybe being the 31st state to have school choice.
Yeah.
We're kind of red in name on
We've
it.
been, like, some people started doing this 30, 40 years ago. You've been waiting for a while.
Yeah, I was wondering, in those states that have implemented some form of the principle, the money follows the student, what has been the experience in terms of the improved quality of education? Because, I mean, in my mind, it's the essential issue is not so much money or taxes or whatever, but the quality of education. I mean, it's abysmal in Texas how low our kids are scoring, not only nationally but internationally, and we're throwing so much money at it and getting nothing in return. But I mean, this is obviously a serious problem for Texas.
Yeah, so they have studied this actually, and the last time I read deeply into this was a couple of years ago, but at the time, as far as I know, nothing has changed. I think the Goldwater Institute was the institute that put out this particular study, but it was a meta-analysis of all of the studies that had been done across all of the states to figure out if education outcomes had improved or gotten worse or stayed the same after they had passed some version of a parental choice program. And I'm gonna get the numbers at least close here, but it was ridiculous. It was something like 90+% of the studies found the outcome was positive, and 5 or maybe 8% found that it was neutral, and 1 or maybe 0, I think, found a negative outcome. And yes.
I just want to be respectful of everyone's time. If you got to go, you can pay your tab at the front. And I have a question just as soon as you're.
Okay, yeah, go for it.
Yeah. So several of us are interested in legislative advocacy. Some of us are going down to the Capitol. Some of us are on calls with our state representative, chief of staff, whomever. Does your organization put together any sort of template for how to advocate for the bills that you were talking about earlier?
Yeah, so our typical approach is that there are key points in the legislative session when we'll put out alerts asking people to usually make a phone call, sometimes show up in person if that's possible. And our experience has been that different organizations do it this different ways, right? Our experience has been it is more effective to do a lot of it 2 or 3 times during the session. And part of this is because it's easier to get more people engaged if you can ask them, here's 1 time, 2 times, maybe 3 times when we're asking you to do something big. It's easier for us to get more people involved than kind of a constant trickle, which some people are really good at, but we found to be very difficult to keep engagement. All that to say, what you can expect to hear from us is a couple key times during the session when there's very specific action needed in order to get the bill past some very specific hurdle. And outside of that, I would say generally that yes, if you want to contact a lawmaker, especially when you have a relationship with on any of the bills that I just mentioned, that's always helpful. Here's one thing I would say is that on the constitutional amendment in particular, it is most advantageous to contact somebody if you know them personally or have a relationship with them. One of the reasons for that is that we want it to be clear in the eyes of the legislature that this is not a partisan bill, right? It's not playing to one particular partisan subgroup or one other particular partisan subgroup because it's such a broad description of parental rights. It should be something that everybody can get behind, and it's even a restatement of current law. All of that to say that on that bill more than other bills, we're relying somewhat heavily on our bill authors inside the legislature to help carry that over the finish line with less outside political pressure just because it's a numbers game. You have to be able to get at least 2/3 votes, which means it can't be partisan. and if it is, it's dead. And I don't think this one has to be, because I think that even lawmakers who aren't of a conservative disposition necessarily, I think, and my experience so far has been, can get behind the idea that it's good to put a restatement of what is currently protected for parents in federal law into Texas law, and that even if they didn't think it was the best idea from a policy perspective, politically it's certainly in their best interest, and it's easy to defend.
You have a website, you have a link where you can keep us updated about
Yes, so the familyfreedomproject.org is the website where you'll get information and all kind of ongoing articles about all of the things that I just described from a parental rights perspective. THSC.org, that's Texas Homeschool Coalition, THSC.org is where you're gonna find information about anything that's about education-related policy. So,
if I can suggest, take time to read a little bit of the Texas State GOP platform, the 22 platform. You can download the PDF, do a Control F on your computer and search out the words like choice. You come down and get familiar with the principles, the priorities, and the planks related to school choice before you talk to your lawmakers. Because then you can speak from the standpoint of the platform. The platform represents the vast majority of all of the voters in Texas. And it's a grassroots all the way from the precinct conventions, the county conventions, Senate district conventions, up to the state convention. And it's well written, and you don't have to know the whole platform. If you know just those issues on school choice and the priorities of the party, this is partisan, but this is also when you're talking to your lawmakers, whether they're Democrat or Republican, they need to know what the majority of Texans want.
Yeah.
And it's there.
Yeah, and here's one thing I would say is that if it feels like a hurdle to get familiar with too many bills because there are too many of them and they're too big and there are too many different issues floating around, one really effective thing you can do is to ask whatever lawmaker you're talking to, basically put it on them and say, tell me what it is you plan to do for education choice and parental rights this legislative session. And then see if their answer satisfies you, and if it's not, demand more.
But school choice is not one of the priorities of the mean, education, it's not.
Yeah, it depends on what the term means, right? Because the
Parental rights, which is called.
and education freedom or education, yes, it's, I can't remember the exact wording, but the parental rights plank, yes, I feel like
All
you're.
right, ladies and gentlemen, whenever you feel like you're ready, our check should be at the front. I hope everything was okay. Y'all are very fantastic. God bless you guys.
Thank you.
Thank you, dear.
So yeah, the parental rights plank and the education freedom plank got merged during the priority setting process, so they're the same one.
When it comes to the school choice one, I know in other states when the money follows the child from homeschooling, that a lot of times it's come with requirements of testing and things. Has there been any discussion on that?
Yeah, so, okay, so yeah, let me spend a couple minutes on this. I'll try and be brief but clear at the same time that definitions matter a lot on this question. The question it roughly is about whether or not negative effects have come to homeschooling and probably private schooling too in other states when they've passed some form of an education follows the child policy. And the simplest, clearest answer is to say, first of all, that in the last 20 years in the US, there's not been a single state that has had a homeschool regulation increase for any reason at all, whether it had a school choice policy in place or not. That's despite dozens of attempts to get those types of regulations passed. And there has never been a single state anywhere in the country that has seen a regulation increase on homeschooling happen after passing an education choice program. And there's a distinction here that's worth making, especially when you're having a conversation with somebody about this, that it's one thing to say, here's a voluntary program and there are rules required to comply with that program. It's a different thing to say, this voluntary program will pass, and if it passes, it might affect people even if they didn't choose to participate. I try and separate those two things as far as the East is from the West, so to speak, because the point is that philosophically this matters a lot, right? That if I'm talking to a parent, there's one way you conceptualize this argument where basically what they're saying would be, I don't want my neighbor to have opportunity because I'm afraid it will affect me. If that's the argument, what I would say is, well, that's fine if you can present a really tremendous amount of evidence that whatever opportunity they're going to have is actually going to affect you. And if it's not, then I have a really hard time buying that argument, right? Because people should be able to make choices for their own children, which is kind of the whole premise of the argument to begin with. And when I approach it that way, I look at the data from around the country and my conclusion is, well, that's never happened anywhere. So it's really hard for me to buy the argument that we shouldn't pass an opportunity for your neighbor because you're afraid something will happen to you, because that's never happened anywhere, right? And theoretically, it's a concern worth considering, but when it's never happened anywhere, it's hard to deny somebody else the opportunity. And one more thing, real fast, for clarity, that despite that, one of the things that we've advocated for in all of the bills that we've helped work on is language that specifically prohibits the bill from being interpreted in a way that would allow the government control over the education program of the family. And so that's kind of the general landscape. The other thing I would say is there are good ways and bad ways to build a program, even if it's voluntary, right? And ultimately, the fact that it's voluntary is probably the most important piece, but there are still good ways and bad ways to build it. And so there are more details than what I just described, but that's the big picture.
What you have the issue with the neighbor situation is that, well, what about all those people that can't afford, the point is you would give them money, it would follow the child, but you still have people that just say, oh, this is gonna just, every low-income family it's just gonna ruin it. It's just, they have their choices, education choices, they won't make the right decisions, or how does this, they're the ones who are gonna be destroyed all through this.
I'm not sure if I understand that.
Well, I mean, the situation where you've got public schools, the whole focus for many, at least in small counties, is that you've got a large majority of low income or, outside the county.
Yep.
The city may have some money, but you've got, a lot of county folks that cannot afford any other choice except the public school option. So yeah, that type of thing is going to come into play mostly when you're talking about what type of a bill can actually pass. Right.
So Arizona, I think, is the biggest state now that has some version of a universal education choice program in place, which means everybody's eligible and you can get X number of dollars from the state if you participate in the program. Almost every other state has one or more very restricted programs, which means only this type of person is eligible. One of the simple reasons for that is that politically it's way easier to get a small program passed than a big one. Second one is that fiscally it's easier to get a small program passed than another one, because, and here's another thing, it is very, very unlikely that whatever bill passes will include eligibility for people who are currently outside the public school system. It's technically possible, but politically it is very unlikely. One of the reasons for that is that it would come with a lot more fiscally complicated problems, because you have all these, in that situation you would have all these people outside the system who are saving the state money, and now you're allocating new money for those people. It means you're not saving it anymore, right? And so it becomes more difficult, even if philosophically it makes sense. And so in practical terms, the solutions that people usually move towards are you start with the program small, certain people are eligible, usually those are only people currently in the public school system, and then they'll narrow it more usually and say either people below this income level or people with special needs students. Basically they're trying to target the people most likely to need the program the most and start there. And the theory is you get that passed and it's easier to expand it later.
But have you actually really seen that happen with the expansion later?
That is the only way it has ever happened in any other state.
Yeah, you're seeing that in Florida right now. They're discussing some ways to fund homeschoolers. It's like an experiment with like $20 million.
And in Arizona, it was close to 10 years ago, maybe a little more, when they passed the original small version of the program. And just, I think last year is when they finally made it universal.
Yeah, because I mean, it took them that long to have this big of a budget. So I don't know if anybody else follows along with this, but I'm in the tax world. And so, there was a period of time after COVID, and particularly with one of the federal bailouts, where everybody's budgets they were massive. California's already burned theirs up. We've got like 30 some odd billion dollars in surplus, and it's just burning a hole in our legislators' pockets. So why not take this opportunity to spend that money instead of wasting on something stupid?
Well, all right, I'm not in the tax world, but I can tell you that one of the biggest proposals on the table this session is about using that state surplus to buy down property taxes. And the debate again, that's not the main area that I'm working in, but the debate that I'm hearing mostly right now is, should we spend half the surplus or should we spend all of it on buying down property taxes?
So Abbott's gonna try to run against Trump too, is that it? Like, that's the dumbest thing.
All right, I got my last two presidential predictions wrong, so.
Right, they're not gonna give us permanent property tax relief, so why?
There are
that?
proposals on the table actually for permanent property tax relief, and
How
they're
are you
usually
gonna pay for it?
gradual. I think this is Tom Oliverson, I'm pretty sure Tom Oliverson, state representative, is the one who's working on this proposal, but the idea is to put into law a requirement that state surplus is used according to a certain formula. And that formula would result in the gradual buying down of property taxes until they're eliminated.
So kind of like California Tabor, but the taxpayer bill of rights, but applying that in the Texas property tax world, basically. So not California, Colorado. In Colorado, they have to return over a certain amount of money back to the taxpayers in some cases.
I grew up there, by the way, like the most I ever got was $8.
It's gotten more significant in the last few years. They're starting to they're getting really creative with how they screw the taxpayers on that now.
Yeah, that's right. They find ways to spend that money. So.
Sir,
Yes.
back in years past with homeschooling, this has come up before. And the big.
This concern you mean, right?
Yes,
Yeah.
and about the money following the child.
Right.
The big concern back then was that they would start to tell you what to teach and they would tell you what you could and couldn't do forward. So that would be my only question, would be how can we keep that from taking place?
Yeah, so there are two answers to that. And the question for everybody is, how can you make sure that any type of education choice program doesn't give the state authority to decide the curriculum of a homeschool family or a private school family or anybody else? So there are two answers to that. First one is it matters how you draft the bill, right? And so when we've been involved, any of the bills we've been involved in drafting, we made sure it was crafted such that the only types of decisions that the state is allowed to make about how the dollars can be spent is a kind of a quantitative decision of, is this expense education related, period. A qualitative decision about whether or not I like the form of education, or if it's good enough, or if it's going to teach them, up to such and such standard of academic proficiency, those are specifically not in the jurisdiction of the state to be able to make decisions on. And there are enough states now that have passed similar legislation that we have a fairly good idea of how to construct the bill in order to account for that. And basically it just depends on how you craft the categories. Like, you can even spend money at Walmart so long as you can verify that the money that you spent was for educational related items. And then another way to split it out is to figure out, like, for different types of items, depending on how easy it is to tell if they're education related or not. Like, you have a receipt from Walmart for $1,000, only $100 is spent on education items, right? So some bills have a proposal that say, under certain circumstances, instead of being able to use the money up front, you submit it afterwards and you get reimbursed for the portion of the expense that was education related. So the deeper you go into it, the more.
That's why it didn't win last time, because they didn't have that in the works. And that's why it didn't go through last time, because there was a concern about control. Because, I mean, they tell you what you have to have so many credits in certain areas by the state, and that's understandable. But the concern was they were going to be able to tell you what curriculum you could or couldn't use.
Right, yes, and that's always been a concern. And here's the other thing, is like, I just kind of done making an argument about how that concern hasn't come to fruition anywhere. But that doesn't mean it's not a valid concern, right? Because the fact that you have the concern is one of the things that motivates you to craft the bill in a way that it doesn't become a problem. So, yeah, so I'm not trying to be dismissive of the concern so much as I'm trying to say there's a proper way to move forward to solve for it.
So what you're saying about like the money, and if you went to Walmart and you could prove that it was like educational purposes, so I'm wanting homeschool, and it would be like almost a flexible spending account for like for parents. So like if I wanted to go buy my homeschool curriculum from, let's say, Becca, I could use that money towards that and to use it towards, let's say I needed pencils and paper and all that stuff.
Yeah, so I'll caveat this by saying it depends completely on which bill we're talking about, right? But one of the versions of the proposal that has been floated, or some of them, have been basically, there are certain expenses that are automatically approved, and usually it's approved because it's coming from a provider that the state knows only gives educational services, right? But maybe the provider is Amazon, And so, God, did you know that over 80% of families in the U.S. have an Amazon Prime account? That astonished me. We do most of our shopping here now, right? But the point is that, yes, so the point is that for a type of situation where it's like, it's a college, right? Well, they're only giving educational services, so that's easy for the state to just have the money distribute automatically. But maybe instead it's something where you can't tell, on the face of it, whether or not it's an education expense or not. And in that situation, maybe the family applies to get it reimbursed. And basically the idea is like, how do you construct it in a way that gives the best flexibility to families, but also prevents fraud?
Yeah. Which you'll always have.
You enforce the law and lock the fraudsters up, right?
Well, it depends on if you crafted the bill so that the fraudsters are more common than the families. It's like enforcement is difficult.
Enforcement is hard. You don't want a bad bill, right? But the fraud's going to happen. You have to enforce it. You have to make some very well publicized arrests, or the coppers are going to get drained.
Yeah, and the short answer is, in some ways, one of the benefits of being late in line to pass policies like this is that you get to watch all of the other states, how they did it, and then craft a solution that actually worked in all of the other states. So, Matt, I think you had...
Yeah, so I was wondering if you have begun speaking to individual legislators, and if you've spoken to our legislator, and what your read on is on whether or not he supports the legislation that you're talking about. If you don't want to get that specific, maybe
yes,
just talk about.
We can all
And to be clear, all of what I just described is kind of spread out across multiple bills that have been filed and other bills that are maybe going to be filed. It's not necessarily all in one bill with a current bill number. But the answer is yes, we've talked to a lot of people, and we're kind of working in tandem with a bunch of other organizations who are also talking to a lot of people. I have not talked to Justin Holland, who you're talking about, right? Yeah, I have not talked to Justin about it personally. I don't know his position on it.
We do.
You guys do? Sounds like you've all talked to him.
Oh, yeah.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, he's quite adamant about it. He loves public education and thinks school choice.
Yeah, what's interesting is that, I've never worked inside the public school system, but just anecdotally from the people that I have worked with who are inside it.
I was a teacher for 8 years.
My experience so far has been that it is much more common for public school administrators to dislike the idea than public school teachers. And
Hey guys, I really want to hear this.
so, this has been my anecdotal experience so far, and I haven't surveyed it, but the thing that's been interesting to me is that when I talk to a teacher, it is much easier to more quickly get down to the root issue of what's best for the student. When I talk to an administrator, it takes a lot longer to get to that place, right? And it kind of makes sense in that they're an administrator. Their job is to protect the administration, right? And so I think that, we have 1,200 school districts in Texas. That makes us different than every other state. The public education lobby in Texas is humongous.
Yep.
And it's so huge, right, that it's not that difficult for them to bring more people to the Capitol than who are willing to show up elsewhere, especially because Texas is huge. It's hard for people to get there.
Well, the two lobbying organizations are walking distance from the east door of the Capitol. The TASB, Texas Association of School Boards, and the next door neighbor is the Texas Association of School Administrators.
Yeah.
And they pretend to be two separate organizations, and they're one and the same. They work together hand in glove. And right around the corner are the Board of Realtors.
Yeah.
And they also work with them
And
because they have the money.
And here's something interesting. If you plot out the educational outcomes for students by education type, what you'll find is that the order goes like this. At the bottom you have traditional public schools, then academic quality goes up for charter schools, then private schools, then homeschooling, in that order. And the span, by the time you get to the top, is huge. It's about 35 percentile points on some subjects. And my experience so far has been, like I've never been inside the public school education system, right? But I do try and not approach it from an overly cynical perspective, because it seems to me that the big issue we have is that we have mostly good students and mostly good families and mostly good teachers who are being put into a system that makes it really hard to do things well. And you do have some bad teachers and some bad administrators, for sure. And if the system itself is also not set up to make it easy to do things well, then people who are doing things badly have an easier time of making the entire system feel that way. And so I just think that the solution to that is to make it as simple as possible for people to pick from as many different types of education as possible, and then go back to this principle we all started from here, that if you put that decision in the hands of a parent, they'll be able to make the decision that's best for their child. So I'm standing up here from the Texas Homeschool Coalition, and I do think that as a system is the best form of education. I also think the even more fundamental thing is that a parent should be able to make the decision that's best for their child, and that therefore we should craft policies to make it as easy as possible for them to pick the system or even a combination of systems that is best for their child.
Well, that's SGR.
Gonna answer. Just gonna respond. Like, I was talking to a guy at Dallas Jewish Conservatives who is already a state rep and he's running for the Senate. And I asked him about that, like, okay, like, what do you think the actual support is for this? And he's like, I'm just gonna tell you right now, it's like, you're not gonna, I don't see any current change in support, compared to last year. This is like when he was running in October when I talked to him. It's like, I don't see any support regardless. Like, even after we had the big ballot referendum, where it's like 90% on it, close to 90% of Republicans said, I want funding to follow the student, that apparently didn't change like a single Republican's opinion.
Oh yeah, I guess maybe we should start.
According to that guy, I mean, I don't know how often he keeps a tab on what all of this people are saying.
That is definitely not my experience. And I don't know if we're close enough to that it's more likely than not that it will actually pass, but I can tell you that I think we're way closer to passing something now than we were 2 years ago.
Well, what is Dave's, like Dave Fellon or whatever it is?
Dave Phelan, yeah.
Yeah, Dave, I always know mispronouncing his name. I just was looking at like interviews from like 2 months ago on the news. It's like, oh, there's no way this is gonna pass. And it's like, no, it might pass.
I mean, I haven't spoken with him about it personally. I've spoken to some people who have spoken to him about it personally, and the big picture sense that I get from the Texas House is that you have a core of people who hate it and will always hate it. You have a core of people who love it and will always love it, and you have a much bigger group of people who are willing for it to go either way than we had 2 years ago. That third group is the group that I think has grown over the last 2 years. And one of the biggest reasons is because of COVID. So here's something interesting. 2 years ago, we passed a bill called the UIL Equal Access Bill. Does anybody know what this is? Okay. It only took us 20, maybe 25 years to pass it. So the idea is that homeschool students should be able to compete in public school sports in a district that they live in and that their tax dollars are going to. Most states do that now. And again, Texas was way behind the curve. That bill was much more a partisan bill until 2 years ago, which was mostly post-COVID. When it got to the floor of the Texas House, we had just over 50% of Republicans and just over 50% of Democrats supporting the bill. And the basic split, if you were to go shift the names around to figure out who's in favor and who's against, what you discover is all of the people who were kind of anti-establishment on both the conservative side and the progressive side supported the bill. And all the people who were more establishment on the Republican side and the Democrat side were against the bill. That was the first time anything approximating a parental choice education bill had ever passed the Texas House. And it's different in some important ways from the types of bills that we're talking about now. But I think what it definitely demonstrated was that there was huge movement inside the legislature among people who were previously ambivalent on the question, but are now willing to make it easier for people to make educational decisions. We passed that 2 years ago. It took us 25 approximately years to get to that point. We had never had a vote on the floor of the Texas House before. And the single biggest thing that made it possible last time was COVID. It changed the opinions of a lot of people.
Does it seem kind of like it's almost generational a little bit of who's willing to vote for what? Because, I mean, you still have a bunch of like George Bush style Republicans that are in their 70s there. I remember there's like one guy like slightly west of Fort Worth. It's like, dude, the guy's been sitting there for 20 years. And I know the Tea Party tried to take him out, but was unsuccessful. It's like, this guy's biggest rhino that walked the face of the earth. This is just a cat still.
Charlie. Yeah, there is a generational difference. The newer, it is more common for new people who are coming in to be in favor than to be against. Yeah.
You have a very favorable chance of getting.
So SJR 29 was submitted as a constitutional
Paxton.
amendment. That's by Paxton.
Yeah.
That's the one that'll give the parental rights for the school choice.
Yeah, it's another constitutional amendment.
Is instead of, I just had to decide, instead of having like the money follow the child, is there a way to like have a tax write-off if you're like you have homeschool, like something like that? You know what I'm
Yes,
talking about?
so a lot of states have done that, and again, I'm not the tax expert, but my understanding is that one of the reasons it has not been feasible in Texas is because we have a very different taxing system than most states. Like, we don't have income tax.
Yeah, we don't really pay a state tax, so we get sales tax.
Matt,
Maybe one or two more questions.
all right, let's see 2 more.
So, yeah, basically, we don't have income tax unless you're a business, and certain businesses actually pay that tax.
Right.
I will say one of the best ways to fund it in Texas would be go to a full disclosure state. We're one of 13 states where when property sells, nobody has any idea what it is except for the actual borrowers themselves, or if it's reported on the MLS. I've butted my head with Justin Holland on this because, well, one, I'm actually an appraiser. He's a broker. So he wants this information to be hidden from the public. So when you have like Tesla that comes in and they build a multi-million-dollar property, or realistically $1 billion, that is not known to the CAD as to what it was actually bought for or built for.
Right.
And so these companies will then go to the district court, file an appeal, and they'll pay $400 for this because in the end they end up actually saving several hundreds of thousands of dollars a year in taxes. And that's also one of the reasons why residential property taxes are so high, is because the businesses aren't actually taxed at fair market value like the residential properties.
That is correct.
So I'll throw it real quick on that. If you guys aren't protesting your residential properties, do it. That's one of the reasons why our assessments are so high, is because they're looking at everybody who doesn't protest, and they're comparing my house to yours. So protest your taxes. Tesla's going to protest even if that is public, and they're going to win. They're going to win because it might set the value the first year, but after that the value is different on commercial property. They're going to win. They pay really good lawyers. They get really smart people. The reality of it is that we all got to start the beast. Okay, shouldn't Tesla doing it.
We want to do one more. Anybody have one more, or one more done? All right, well, thank you guys, appreciate it.
Jeremy, thank you so much. Thanks to everybody who came out. Again, our next meeting is going to be on March 30th, and we will be discussing border security, and it will be at Smoke Month. Smoke Month, yes. That's yeah, please check out our website, subscribe to our newsletter, and we've got the next meeting March 30th, and also the book club. Thanks.